They sold the Hamptons estate, the only place my grandmother ever promised would be mine, to fund Daniel's $1 million wedding. Chandeliers, caviar, champagne fountains. And when my father raised his glass, he announced it to hundreds of guests, as if I were invisible. Everyone applauded. I sat frozen, humiliated, while the house filled with my childhood summers was gone. My name is Maddie Clark, and this is how I cut my parents off forever. The coast opened beside me, and the water caught the late light like polished metal. I took the turn toward the dunes without thinking. My hands felt damp on the wheel by the time the hedges thinned and the house came into view. Cedar shingles softened by salt, a wide porch that seemed to float above beach grass, the path I used to race along as a kid. The only thing that did not belong was the sign staked into the yard. For sale. The words hit with the kind of blunt force that makes you swallow before you can breathe. I pulled to the curb and killed the engine. The ocean sounded close and steady, the same steady that used to anchor me when I was small. I sat for a beat with my fingers pressed into the steering wheel. Then I stepped out, and the air tasted like salt and sun-warmed wood. The front gate gave with a tired creak under my hand. I crossed the yard slowly, as if moving too fast might wake something I did not want to face. On the porch, I let my palm slide over the railing. The grain caught at my skin, the way it always had. I could see a flash of a much younger me, in a paint-stained t-shirt, on this same porch, while Grandma set up an easel and a jar of brushes. One memory pressed forward. Daniel had come back from a soccer camp with a medal hanging heavy on a ribbon. My parents lit up like a stage. I had tried to show my grandmother a clumsy painting of the horizon and told her that no one cared. She had touched the edge of the canvas and said that my work mattered whether anyone else understood it or not. She had hung that canvas in the upstairs hall, and I had walked by it a dozen times a day just to feel seen. I looked at the windows now, the shutters closed, the porch chairs stacked at the side, as if the house had been told to be quiet. The sign in the yard felt like a trespass. I stepped down into the sand-edged grass and crossed to it. The wood post was new and cool against my fingers. For a single beat, I thought about yanking it free, about ripping it out and tossing it into the back of my car. My hand tightened. A car slowed at the curb, and an older couple peered out. The woman lifted a phone and took a picture. I let go of the post and wiped my hand on my jeans. I walked the path along the side of the house. The screen door was latched, and I could see a lockbox hanging from the knob. A neat sticker from a brokerage I recognized sat near the frame. The sight made something hot rise behind my eyes. I tried the door anyway, because habit is stronger than good sense. It did not move. I stepped back and drew a breath that did not go very far. Another car eased to a stop on the street. A man in a navy blazer got out and paused at the gate. He looked at me in that polite, curious way people do when they think you might belong, but are not sure. He asked if I was with the showing. He did not use those exact words, but the meaning was the same. I told him I was family. He nodded and said that there was a private appointment scheduled later, and that any questions should go through the number on the sign. He was courteous and careful, and I hated him for it for half a second. I thanked him and said I would do that. He lingered and then returned to his car, and I was left with the sound of the ocean and the ache in my chest. I took out my phone and snapped a photo of the sign. I took another of the lockbox and the sticker. I did not text anyone. I thought about calling Grandma, then put the phone away. I did not want worry in her voice. I did not want to hear her try to smooth over something that should not be smoothed. The wind lifted the tall grass, and I watched it lean and rise as if the dunes were breathing. I went back up the steps and sat on the top one. The wood warmed the backs of my legs through my clothes. From here, I could see the sliver of beach between the dunes and the sky that stretched in a color I used to mix with too much white. I concentrated on exactly what was in front of me so that my mind would not leap ahead to the why. Why would there be a sign? Why would any of this be happening without a call to me? Why would a promise spoken more than once start to feel like a story I had invented? A gull coasted by and gave a sharp cry that sounded like a laugh. I rubbed my thumb along the ridge of a splinter and made myself catalog details. The porch needed oil. The screens needed repair. The hydrangeas at the side were late but heavy with buds. This was the language of a place that belonged to us. To me. My chest tightened again, and I stood. I told myself to be practical. I took photos of the yard from 3 angles. I zoomed in on the brokerage logo and the phone number. I opened the Notes app and typed the date and time and a simple sentence that the house had a for sale sign and a lockbox present. My hand shook just enough that I had to correct a letter. I locked the screen and put the phone back into my pocket. 2 teenagers bicycled past and called out a greeting. They kept going toward the water. Their tires clicked in a rhythm that made me think of the old wind chime that used to hang near the door. I could hear it sometimes when I fell asleep upstairs as a kid. I pressed my palm to the porch post one more time, not because it could give anything back, but because the feeling of the woods steadied me. A memory flashed that had nothing to do with medals or approval. Grandma sitting on the sand with her shoes off and her toes buried like a kid. She told me that every house holds a story, and that some stories are not finished just because people say they are. I held on to that. It made the air in my lungs feel less thin. My phone buzzed. I expected the gallery that had been considering a small series of beach studies. Instead, it was my mother. Family dinner at the house in Greenwich at 7. We will be going over the rehearsal timeline and the final budget. Do not be late. There was a second line after a pause in the message. Do not make this difficult. Daniel needs everyone aligned. I stared at the screen until the words blurred. Then I read them again, and the blur sharpened into something like resolve. I saved the message and slid the phone away. The breeze shifted, and the smell of the ocean lifted the hair at the back of my neck. I thought about walking down to the water and letting the surf run over my shoes the way I used to. But the lockbox at the door and the sign in the yard had already done enough damage for one afternoon. I stepped off the porch and crossed the yard. At the gate, I looked back at the house in the soft light. For a second, it felt like the place looked back the way you glance at someone you love when they do not know you are watching. Then a cloud moved, and the light changed, and it was just shingles and paint and rooms I could not enter. I got into the car and started the engine. The air conditioner pushed a tired breath over my face. I checked the time. If I left now, I would barely make it to Greenwich by 7. The thought of sitting across from my mother while she spoke in that careful tone about timelines and budgets made my shoulders tense. The thought of my father asking about deliverables and vendors as if he were running a board meeting made my jaw set. The dunes slid past in the side mirror as I pulled away. I told myself to keep the car between the lines and not to think about anything I could not control. The house receded behind me, and the ocean turned from silver to pewter. My phone buzzed again with a calendar reminder for the dinner I had not agreed to but would attend. I gripped the wheel a little tighter and pictured the sign in the yard one more time. Then I pictured my mother's face when I asked her who had put it there. The Clark estate glowed the way it always did in early summer. The long driveway lined with lamps and trimmed hedges cut so sharp they looked like they had been drawn with a ruler. I parked at the far end of the circular drive away from Daniel's new car, gleaming under the portico, and braced myself. My mother's text still sat on my phone, reminding me in her clipped words not to make things difficult. Inside the dining room looked like a set piece from a magazine spread. Silver polished to a mirror crystal glasses, glinting beneath the chandelier roses set at perfect intervals along the table. Daniel was already seated at my father's right, Charlotte beside him, her diamond catching the light every time she lifted her hand. She smiled politely when I walked in, but the glow around her was unmistakable. This was her stage too. Maddie, my mother said with a smile that did not quite touch her eyes. You made it. I drove straight from the studio, I answered, pulling out a chair halfway down the table. Studio. My father repeated his tone flat, as if the word itself were suspect. Then his gaze shifted back to Daniel. Now, Daniel, tell us again about the partners at Clark Properties. They're already talking about expanding your responsibilities, aren't they? Daniel gave a modest shrug, though I could see the pride in his eyes. They've asked me to oversee a new commercial development in Stamford. It's a big project. I'm excited. Of course you are, my father said. Wharton graduates are in demand. You've proven you can carry the Clark name with the weight it deserves. My mother leaned toward Charlotte. And soon, with the wedding, everything will fall into place. Your families will be so proud. I unfolded my napkin slowly, trying to still the heat rising in my chest. No one asked about my work. No one ever did. Dinner was served in courses, each one announced by the housekeeper, as if we were at a gala. Between bites of salmon and asparagus, I found myself staring at the flicker of the candles, wishing I could disappear into the wax. Did you ever think, my mother said, suddenly turning toward me, that your life would be different if you had chosen something practical? The table went quiet. Even Charlotte lowered her glass. My father did not wait for me to answer. If you had gone into business, Maddie, instead of whatever it is you do with paints and children's finger drawings, you might be sitting where your brother is now. Success takes discipline, not daydreams. The words landed like stones. I pressed my fork into the edge of my plate to keep from shaking. Daniel shifted uncomfortably. Dad, maybe? No, Daniel, my father cut him off. She needs to hear this. You are the example of what commitment brings. She is the example of wasted potential. Do you know how many family friends ask me what Maddie is doing with her degree? I am tired of having no answer. My mother added her part, her voice smooth but edged. Daniel is our pride. You, Maddie, are only good at making us worry. The humiliation slid under my skin, not sharp, but dull and suffocating. I swallowed and felt the room tilt. I wanted to fight back, to say that my classes in Brooklyn kept children safe after school, that some of them smiled only when they had a brush in their hand. I wanted to say that art had value, that it had saved me more times than I could count. But the words stuck. Daniel cleared his throat. She is doing something good, Mom. She's helping kids. That matters. My father gave him a look that silenced him. We are not talking about charity, Daniel. We are talking about legacy. You carry ours. She does not. The room exhaled in silence. Even the silverware seemed to still. I stared at the tablecloth, tracing the stitched pattern until it blurred. When dessert arrived, a lemon tart cut into precise slices, my appetite was gone. I pushed the plate slightly away, earning a disapproving glance from my mother. She tapped her spoon lightly, as if to remind me I was already a disappointment for not eating. Charlotte leaned toward me, then her voice low enough for only me to hear. I think what you do is wonderful. My cousin took art therapy after her accident. It helped her more than doctors could. Her kindness was unexpected, and it almost undid me. I forced a small smile, but the knot in my throat held. Conversation turned back to the wedding. Budgets, florists, menus. My mother listed numbers as if she were reading from a balance sheet. My father spoke of guest lists and investors who would attend. I sat quietly, hearing only fragments, until one phrase cut through. The sale of the Hamptons property will ensure the reception is unforgettable, my father said. I froze. Charlotte glanced at me quickly, then back at her plate. Daniel coughed, shifting in his chair. My mother continued as if nothing had been said, detailing seating arrangements. I forced my breathing, steady hands locked under the table. The house. My house. The one Grandma had promised. I excused myself early, standing before my mother could protest. Thank you for dinner, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. My father barely looked up. My mother gave a thin smile. Daniel's eyes followed me as I left the room. Something unspoken in his gaze, but he said nothing. The night air outside was heavy and warm. I walked to my car without looking back at the chandelier light spilling through the tall windows. My phone buzzed with another message from my mother, already scheduling fittings and tastings, as if the evening had been nothing but successful planning. I slid into the driver's seat, gripping the wheel until my knuckles whitened. The words replayed in my head, sharp and undeniable. The sale of the Hamptons property. My chest tightened. It was no longer a suspicion, it was a fact. And I knew that if they had gone this far without telling me, what came next would be worse. The next morning, I drove straight to Grandma Rose's house in Westport, the small clapboard cottage that had always smelled faintly of lavender and sea air. I had not slept much, my head crowded with my father's voice announcing the sale of the Hamptons house like it was a simple financial transaction. My chest was tight as I parked along the curb. The shutters were half closed, and for the first time the place looked fragile, as if it had aged overnight. Inside the living room was dim. Grandma sat in her armchair by the window, a quilt over her knees, even though it was warm outside. Her skin seemed thinner, her eyes softer, and when she smiled at me, it carried the weight of effort. "You look tired, Maddie," she said gently. I knelt beside her, taking her hand. "So do you, Grandma. Are you all right?" Her hand trembled in mine. She hesitated, then sighed. "The doctors confirmed it yesterday. Pancreatic cancer, stage 4. They give me months, maybe less if I am unlucky." The words landed with a finality I was not prepared for. I felt the breath leave me, and for a moment I could only shake my head as if denial could undo it. "No," I whispered. "No, they have to try something. There must be a treatment, surgery, anything." She lifted her free hand and smoothed my hair the way she had when I was a child. "We tried scans, blood work, consultations. There is nothing more they can do, Maddie. I have accepted it." Tears pricked hot at the corners of my eyes, but I forced myself to keep them back. She did not need my despair, she needed my strength. I squeezed her hand tighter. "Then I'll be here," I said. "Whatever you need, whatever time there is, I'll be here." She smiled faintly. "That's all I could want." A knock on the door startled us. It was Dr. Levine, her longtime physician, carrying a folder. He greeted us quietly, sat on the edge of the sofa, and repeated what she had already told me. Tumor inoperable. The cancer had spread. Months, not years. He outlined hospice care options, speaking gently as if each word could bruise. I barely absorbed the details. My eyes stayed fixed on Grandma's face, on the calm dignity she somehow maintained. When he left, I felt hollow, like the walls had tilted. She waited until the door clicked shut before speaking again. "There is something I need to tell you, Maddie. Something important." I nodded, throat tight. "The Hamptons house?" She said, her voice firmer now. "It is yours. I made that decision years ago. It is the place where you found yourself, and I wanted it to remain your anchor." I shook my head, biting down hard against the sting in my chest. "They sold it, Grandma. Last night at dinner, Dad said they sold it to pay for Daniel's wedding. They never even told me." Her lips pressed together, her hand tightening around mine. "Of course they did. They always saw you as expendable. But listen to me. That house was meant for you because I wanted you to know you are loved, Maddie. Not for what you produce, not for what title you hold. For who you are." The tears I had held back spilled hot down my cheeks. "I had plans, Grandma. I wanted to use part of it to open a gallery, a studio for kids who can't afford art classes. I thought it could be a place to give back what you gave me." Her eyes glistened. "Then you will still do that. The walls do not matter as much as the vision. I have other assets, Maddie. Investments, stocks, accounts. About 12 million in all. I am restructuring everything so that when the time comes, it will pass to you." I stared at her, stunned. "Grandma, that's everything. They'll hate you for it. They already resent me for loving you the way they should have." She answered simply. "This is not about them. It is about you continuing what we started on that porch when you were 8 years old, when you first held a brush and dared to make your own horizon." I leaned into her, resting my forehead against her shoulder, inhaling the familiar lavender scent. The weight of her words settled into me, heavy but luminous. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," I whispered. She tilted my chin up. "You are stronger than you know. One day you will see that." We sat in silence, the old clock ticking the afternoon sun, sliding across the floorboards. My mind raced with the contradiction of everything I had just heard: her impending death, the betrayal of my parents, the promise of a future she still believed in for me. Her breathing grew shallow and she leaned back, her eyes half closing. "Stay a while," she murmured. "Talk to me about your students. Tell me about the little boy who paints monsters and the girl who draws flowers taller than herself." I did. I told her every story I could think of, painting pictures with words so she could see them. Her lips curved into a small smile, and for a moment, I almost forgot the weight pressing down on us both. When dusk finally dimmed the room, I rose to close the curtains. The cottage smelled of tea and faint medicine. She had drifted into sleep, her hand still resting open on the quilt. I stood there in the fading light, listening to the sound of her breathing, and made a silent vow. Whatever came next, I would not let her faith in me be wasted. As I turned off the lamp and slipped quietly out, my phone buzzed with another message from my mother, this time about Daniel's rehearsal dinner at the plaza in Manhattan. The words glared from the screen sharp against the dark. I stared at them until my hands shook. The Hamptons' house was gone. Grandma was slipping away, and my parents were already planning their next spectacle. The ballroom at the plaza glittered as if it were built to blind. Chandeliers hung like inverted galaxies, casting light across mirrored walls and marble floors, polished until they reflected the heels of every guest who passed. I stood for a moment near the entrance, clutching my small black purse, the weight of the room pressing down. The air hummed with chatter, with the clink of glasses, with photographers snapping shots of gowns and tuxedos that looked custom-fit for royalty. A maitre d' in a crisp jacket directed me to a table near the back, tucked beside a column, and half hidden from the rest of the hall. A single place card with my name waited there, isolated. Around me, the other tables filled quickly with friends of Daniel, business partners of my father, polished people who glanced my way briefly before looking past me. The laughter at the front of the room pulled my attention. Daniel stood surrounded by colleagues and old school friends, Charlotte by his side, in a pale silk dress that glowed under the chandeliers. Her left hand rested carefully on his arm, her diamond flashing like a tiny sun every time she moved. I lowered myself into the chair, feeling the isolation as deliberate. A waiter filled my glass with champagne, and I took a sip, though my stomach twisted. At the center tables, the servers brought oysters and caviar. At mine, the plates came later, the food already cooling. The MC welcomed everyone, introducing Daniel and Charlotte as though they were celebrities. Cameras flashed as Charlotte raised her hand to display the stone each facet, throwing sparks across the room. Daniel was praised for his leadership at Clark Properties, his trajectory described as inevitable brilliance. I watched my parents smile from their table of honor, pride radiating off them, as if they had personally built him from marble. Conversations around me blurred. I caught fragments from guests at the next table. How generous the Clarks were. How this wedding would be remembered in Manhattan circles for years. Someone whispered that even investors from Boston had flown in just to attend. I pushed my fork gently across the plate, the clatter swallowed by the orchestra playing near the dais. My chest felt tight, and I caught myself counting the minutes until it might be acceptable to leave. Then my father rose. The room hushed immediately. Edward Clark did not need a microphone, his voice carried with ease, polished from decades of boardroom presentations. Tonight is more than a celebration of two remarkable young people. He began, his gaze sweeping the crowd before settling proudly on Daniel and Charlotte. It is a demonstration of what legacy means. Charlotte comes from a family of integrity and strength, and together with our son Daniel, they represent the very best of our future. Applause rippled through the room. I stared at the tablecloth, willing myself invisible. My father lifted his glass. You all see the beauty of this evening, the care taken with every detail. It was not achieved lightly. We wanted our son's engagement to reflect the scale of his promise. And so to make this possible, we chose to part with something precious. We sold the Hamptons estate to fund this wedding. It was a decision made with pride, because Daniel deserves nothing less. The words fell into the silence like a hammer. For an instant there was no sound at all, then the hall erupted in applause. Guests clapped, some even rose to their feet. Daniel flushed, Charlotte pressed her hand to her chest, her diamond catching another round of light. My mother beamed, her pearls gleaming at her throat. I sat frozen, my glass trembling in my hand. The world tilted. The Hamptons estate, my house. Grandma's promise announced to a ballroom full of strangers as nothing more than currency to prove Daniel's worth. A woman at the next table leaned toward her companion, whispering about how extraordinary it was to sacrifice a property like that for family. Her voice carried just enough for me to hear. My throat closed, the air in the room too heavy. I set the glass down carefully so it would not shatter. My palms burned with the urge to stand and shout, to tell them all that it had been mine, that it had been stolen. Instead, I sat still, the humiliation burning hotter with every clap that echoed off the walls. Daniel glanced across the room, then his eyes catching mine for a fraction of a second. Something flickered there. Discomfort, guilt maybe, before he looked away, quickly raising his glass to acknowledge the praise. Charlotte's smile trembled, as if she too had heard the edge in my father's voice, but she stayed silent. The orchestra swelled again, covering the sound of my chair scraping back slightly. I could not breathe under those lights any longer. My father's voice, proud and final, replayed in my skull, every syllable cutting deeper. I folded my napkin, placed it neatly by the untouched tart, and rose. Guests barely noticed as I slipped through the crowd toward the side exit. The air outside hit cold against my skin, the night thick with the smell of rain on the city streets. I leaned against the stone wall of the plaza, my hands pressed flat against the surface to steady myself. The applause from inside still rang faintly through the doors, a reminder that the people I called family had just erased me with a toast. The Hamptons house was gone in truth now, not just on paper, and the proof had been celebrated before hundreds. As I stepped away from the ballroom doors, my phone buzzed again, this time with a message from Daniel himself. 3 words that made me stop under the street lamp, torn between fury and disbelief. "We need to talk." I stared at the words glowing on the screen, my thumb hovering over the reply button, but anger surged too hot to answer. I slipped the phone back into my purse and walked fast toward the street, the echo of clapping still trapped in my head. The Hamptons estate had been sold, and my father had announced it to a room of strangers, as if I had never existed. The next morning I drove to Greenwich. The Clark estate stood immaculate as always, the iron gates opening silently as I keyed in the code. Inside, my mother sat at the breakfast table with a bowl of fruit arranged like a painting. She did not look surprised to see me. "You should have stayed last night," she said calmly, setting her fork down. I dropped my bag onto a chair. "You sold it. The Hamptons house. That was mine. Grandma told me years ago it would be mine." Her expression never shifted. "It was a family asset, Maddie. We made the choice that was best for everyone." For everyone. My voice cracked, fury rising. Or for Daniel. My father entered then, adjusting his cufflinks, his face already hard from the day. "Do not raise your voice in this house. We invested in your brother's future. A marriage that strengthens this family's position, a legacy that means something." I shook my head, barely able to breathe. "That was my legacy. Grandma gave it to me because she saw me when none of you did. You had no right." He stepped closer, his voice cold. "Legally, the property was in a trust. As trustees, your mother and I had full authority. You may have clung to promises, but promises are not binding documents." The words landed sharp, each one cutting deeper than the last. My knees threatened to give. From the doorway, my mother spoke again, softer, but edged with disdain. "Daniel's wedding matters, Maddie. Do you think your little gallery ideas mean more than a future that will carry the Clark name forward?" I turned on her, tears stinging. "You traded me for a party." Silence stretched across the room, broken only by the distant ticking of the grandfather clock. That afternoon, I met with Martin Hale, the family's attorney, in his office downtown. He greeted me with the weariness of a man used to cleaning up after wealthy families. "I need you to tell me the truth," I demanded, clutching the folder he had handed over. "Was there any way they could sell it without my consent?" Martin adjusted his glasses, his tone careful. "The estate was held in a trust with your parents as trustees. The will specifies distribution after your grandmother's passing. Until then, legally, they control the assets. They did not break the law." My breath left me in a rush. "So that's it. They can just erase me." He hesitated. "Morally, one could argue otherwise. But legally, yes. They had the right." I walked out with the file clutched tight, the city spinning around me, horns blaring, pedestrians rushing. Everything felt too loud, too fast. 2 days later, the headline appeared in the Times. "Clark family sells historic Hamptons estate to fund multi-million-dollar wedding." The article described the house in detail: the sweeping ocean views, the cedar shingles, the legacy of the property now traded for one extravagant celebration. There was even a photo of Daniel and Charlotte smiling under the chandeliers at the plaza. By evening, neighbors in Greenwich had already begun their commentary. At the grocery store, I heard a woman whisper, "Poor Maddie, not even strong enough to hold on to her inheritance." On the sidewalk outside the post office, a man I barely knew said with a smirk, "Guess you lost your seat at the table, huh?" I avoided their eyes, walked faster, but their voices followed like shadows. Alone in my apartment that night, I stared at the ceiling, my phone lighting up with texts from acquaintances, pretending to be sympathetic. They wrote things like, "It must be hard to see your brother succeed like this, or maybe now you'll find a real path." Every word pressed heavier on my chest. I wanted to call Grandma to tell her everything, but she was too weak, and the last thing she needed was more weight on her heart. So I sat in the silence, fury building with no place to go. When the phone buzzed again near midnight, I expected another cutting message disguised as sympathy. Instead, it was Daniel, his name glowing on the screen, the message longer this time. "Please, meet me tomorrow. I need to explain." The cafe in downtown Stamford was nearly empty when I walked in the next afternoon. Daniel was already at a corner table, his jacket folded over the chair, his tie loosened. He looked less like the polished heir everyone praised, and more like a man who had not slept. His eyes flicked up when he saw me, relief washing across his face. "Thanks for coming," he said quietly, as I slid into the chair across from him. I set my bag down carefully. "You wanted to explain. Go ahead." He rubbed his temples for a moment, then leaned forward. "You don't understand the pressure Mom and Dad were under. The wedding wasn't just about me and Charlotte. It was about investors, about showing the family's strength. That's why they did what they did." My chest tightened. Pressure. What kind of pressure justifies stealing the one thing that was mine? What pressure makes you stand silent when they humiliate me in front of hundreds of people? You let them say it like it was nothing, like I was nothing. His jaw worked, his eyes narrowing. I didn't let them. I didn't have a choice. I almost laughed, bitter and sharp. "You had every choice. You could have spoken up. You could have said that house wasn't theirs to sell, that Grandma wanted it for me. Instead, you raised your glass and soaked up the applause." His voice rose, catching the barista's attention. "You think it's easy being the perfect son? Do you think I wanted all of this? I am suffocating under their expectations. Every step I take, every word I say has to be flawless. I am not allowed to want anything for myself." I leaned in, anger vibrating through me. "At least you had their approval. At least they let you exist." I was erased, Daniel. Erased in front of strangers. His shoulders slumped, his hands gripping the edge of the table. For a long moment he didn't speak, his breathing shallow. Then his voice broke. "I am exhausted, Maddie. Every day I wake up and wonder if today is the day I disappoint them. Do you know what that does to a person? I envy you. You have freedom even if it came with their disapproval. I have none." The fight drained out of me in an instant. He looked like a man shackled by invisible chains, the golden boy everyone admired crumbling under the weight of his own crown. "You envy me," I whispered. "You watched them strip me of everything. You envied that." Tears shimmered in his eyes, and for the first time since we were children, I saw him without the armor. "Because you can walk away." "I can't. I don't know how." I sat back, my fury tangled with a sorrow I didn't want to feel. Part of me understood, but another part burned with the memory of his silence. "We were both trapped," I said finally, my voice low. "But your silence cut deeper than their cruelty. You knew what that house meant. You let them take it anyway." He closed his eyes, a single tear slipping free. "I don't expect forgiveness. I just needed you to know I'm not as lucky as you think." For a long time we sat in the quiet hum of the cafe, the clatter of dishes and hiss of the espresso machine filling the space between us. I searched his face, torn between anger and pity, but I knew the distance between us was carved too deep. I stood, picking up my bag. "I believe you're hurting, Daniel, but that doesn't erase what happened. It doesn't give me back what was stolen. He didn't try to stop me as I walked to the door. His reflection in the glass looked smaller somehow, like a boy who had never grown into the man he was supposed to be. Outside, the air smelled of rain. My phone buzzed in my hand, and when I glanced down, the name that appeared on the screen was Grandma's. Her voice was faint when I answered, but steady in a way that made me sit down on the curb to listen. She asked me to come to her house that evening, said the family was gathering, and there were things she needed to make clear while she still had the strength. The line clicked off before I could ask more. By the time I reached her Westport cottage, the driveway was already crowded with familiar cars. My father's black sedan gleamed under the streetlight, my mother's silver SUV beside it. Daniel's car was crooked, as if he had pulled in too fast. My stomach twisted as I climbed the steps, the weight of dread pressing heavier with each one. Inside, the air smelled of chamomile tea and wood polish. Grandma sat upright in her armchair, her back straight, her eyes sharp, despite the pallor of her face. Martin Hale, the family attorney, stood at her side with a leather folder. My parents were perched on the sofa, tense, while Daniel lingered near the window, his hands in his pockets. "Sit," Maddie, Grandma said. Her tone left no space for argument. I obeyed, my knees brushing against the coffee table as I took a chair opposite her. She folded her hands on her lap. "We are here tonight because I am not long for this world, and because too much has been left unsaid. That ends now." My mother tried to interject, her voice tight. "Rose, perhaps this conversation can wait until you're stronger." Grandma's gaze cut across the room, silencing her. "I will not wait. My health gives me no such luxury." Martin opened the folder, pulling out a set of documents. "Your grandmother has updated her will and trust. She asked that I read the relevant portion to you all this evening." My father leaned forward, his jaw set. "This is highly irregular." "This is her decision," Martin replied evenly. The words that followed seemed to slow the air itself. The trust, the portfolios, the accounts, all of it totaling roughly $12 million, would be transferred upon her passing into a foundation directed solely by me. I heard the words but struggled to process them. My hands trembled in my lap. My mother's face drained of color. My father erupted. "This is outrageous. You cannot simply hand everything to one grandchild while ignoring the other. It undermines the family structure, the business, everything we have built." Grandma's voice cracked like a whip. "You sold the Hamptons estate to throw a party. That house was meant for Maddie. You showed me who you are, Edward, and I will not reward it." "You are not thinking clearly," my mother snapped. "This is sentimentality talking. The money belongs within the family, not squandered on paint and paper." I shot to my feet, the blood rushing hot through me. "Do not call it squandered. You sold my home for champagne fountains and photo spreads. From today you have no claim on me. You took the roof that was mine, so I am taking myself. We are finished." Silence followed, heavy and raw. Daniel's face crumpled, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. Martin closed the folder with deliberate care. "The paperwork has been notarized and filed. This arrangement is binding. Any attempt to contest it would fail in probate court. Mrs. Clark has acted within her rights." My father's fists clenched on his knees, his knuckles pale. My mother turned her head away, her lips pressed so tightly they blanched. Grandma looked at me, then her eyes softening. "You are free, Maddie. Do not waste that freedom trying to win love that will never be given." My throat closed as tears finally slipped, but I nodded. For the first time in years, I felt something like release. The room buzzed with the low hum of anger, of finality. I stood taller, the words still ringing in the air like a door slammed shut. The ties that had bound me for so long were gone. And just as the silence stretched too far, my phone vibrated again in my pocket. The name on the screen made my breath catch. Charlotte. Charlotte's voice was hesitant when I answered, as if she wasn't sure I would pick up. She asked to meet for coffee, said she had something she needed to tell me. The next morning, we sat by the window of a small cafe near Union Square, the city moving fast outside, while time slowed between us. She looked tired, her hair pulled back, her diamond ring flashing every time her hand shook against the mug. "I didn't know about the house," she said quickly, her eyes searching mine. I found out the night of the party when your father made the announcement. Daniel and I argued for hours afterward. He wanted me to tell you. I should have sooner. I stared into my own untouched coffee. It wouldn't have changed the humiliation. Everyone heard it. Everyone clapped. Charlotte's eyes brimmed with something close to regret. I don't want to be like them. I know what they did to you was cruel. I just wanted you to know you weren't wrong about that house. It was meant for you. I nodded once. I already knew. Grandma made sure I never doubted it. The weeks that followed blurred. Grandma passed quietly in her sleep 2 months later, and though I had braced for it, the grief still knocked me breathless. At her memorial service in Westport, I stood beside the casket, my hands shaking as I placed one of my earliest sketches between the flowers. My parents barely looked at me, their eyes cold and focused on appearances. Daniel kept his distance. Charlotte at his side, though she gave me a small nod that I chose to accept as a kind of truce. The will was executed swiftly. The foundation papers bore my name in bold print, and with Martin Hale's guidance, I moved into an office space in Chelsea. The Foundation for Arts Access opened its doors on a gray morning, and the first group of children from a nearby public school filed in with wide eyes. Brushes clattered in jars, canvas stretched across frames, and for the first time in years, I felt the pulse of belonging return. Articles appeared in local papers, then larger ones. The Times ran a feature titled, "From Family Failure to Foundation Visionary." They wrote about my childhood passion about the betrayal of losing the Hamptons estate, and about the millions now devoted to children who might never otherwise hold a paintbrush. I clipped the articles not for myself, but to pin on the office wall, so every child who came through the door would see what their work meant. Daniel visited once with Charlotte. He walked through the studio slowly, watching the kids paint, listening to their laughter echo off the high ceilings. He told me quietly that he was proud, though the words felt fragile on his tongue. Charlotte hugged me before they left, whispering that she wished my grandmother had lived to see the opening. I never heard from my parents again. Their numbers were blocked, their emails filtered to trash. Silence was the cleanest cut I could give them, and I kept it sharp. One evening after the last class, I drove east. The sun had already dipped low when I reached the Hamptons, and the beach grass bowed in the wind. The house was no longer ours, its windows glowing faintly under new ownership, but the shoreline was unchanged. I walked barefoot to the edge of the surf, the cold water pulling at my ankles. The waves crashed with the same rhythm. I remembered the same sound that once steadied me as a child on the porch with Grandma. I whispered into the salt air, telling her that they had sold the house, but they could never take what mattered. My memories, my work, the children who now painted their own horizons, all of it was untouchable. The wind lifted my hair, and I stood there until the stars began to show. Behind me, the house loomed in silhouette, but it no longer belonged to me. What did was the promise I carried forward, a promise born from a woman who had loved me enough to believe I was worth everything. When I finally turned back toward the car, my phone buzzed in my pocket. The screen lit with a number I did not recognize, but the preview line made my heart still. It was from a journalist asking if I would speak on record about the Clark family.